December 15th, 2023, Portland Memorial Hospital, Oregon. The fluorescent lights of the pediatric oncology ward hummed quietly as another night shift began. In a city known for its rainy winters and close-knit medical community, something unusual was happening within the walls of this respected institution. Something that would eventually unravel into a story that challenged the boundaries between professional duty and personal sacrifice. Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old registered nurse with over a decade of experience, had become a fixture in the pediatric oncology department. Her colleagues had grown accustomed to seeing her arrive for her scheduled 3 to 11 evening shift, only to stay through the night and work straight into the morning hours. This pattern had been repeating itself with remarkable consistency for nearly 6 months, a schedule that would exhaust even the most dedicated healthcare professional. The hospital's Human Resources Department had flagged her timesheet multiple times. The overtime hours were substantial, creating concerns about burnout and patient safety. Yet Sarah continued to volunteer for additional shifts, often covering for colleagues who needed time off, and rarely taking breaks even during her extended hours. Her supervisors noted that she appeared tired, with dark circles under her eyes and a pallor that suggested chronic sleep deprivation. But her work remained impeccable. Not a single complaint had been filed against her, and her patient care reviews were consistently excellent. What made Sarah's behavior particularly noteworthy was her focus on one specific patient. 8-year-old Ethan Roberts had been admitted to the pediatric oncology ward in early July 2023, diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia that had returned after a previous remission. The relapse was aggressive, requiring intensive chemotherapy and round-the-clock monitoring. Ethan's case was particularly challenging because his body had developed resistance to several standard treatment protocols, forcing the medical team to pursue more experimental approaches. Sarah had requested to be assigned as Ethan's primary nurse within days of his admission. This wasn't unusual in itself, as nurses often developed strong bonds with long-term patients, especially children fighting serious illnesses. What caught the attention of the nursing supervisor, Catherine Reynolds, was the intensity of Sarah's dedication. She seemed to know Ethan's needs before he expressed them, anticipated complications before they became critical, and spent her breaks sitting beside his bed when he struggled through difficult nights. The other nurses in the ward noticed Sarah's unusual attachment, but attributed it to her compassionate nature. She had always been known as someone who went above and beyond for her patients. However, as the weeks turned into months, certain behaviors began to raise questions. Sarah was observed checking Ethan's charts during her off hours, sometimes arriving at the hospital on her days off just to review his latest test results. She was seen having intense conversations with Ethan's oncologist, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, requesting detailed explanations of treatment plans and prognoses that went beyond what a floor nurse typically needed to know. Ethan's adoptive parents, Michael and Amanda Roberts, were grateful for Sarah's attentiveness. Michael worked long hours as a construction supervisor, and Amanda balanced a part-time administrative job with caring for their 2 other children at home. The financial and emotional strain of Ethan's illness had pushed them to their limits. They appreciated having a nurse who genuinely seemed to care about their son's well-being, someone who would text them updates even when she wasn't officially on duty, someone who remembered Ethan's favorite stories and would read to him during difficult treatment days. But even the Roberts family began to notice peculiarities in Sarah's knowledge of their son. She seemed aware of details about Ethan's early childhood, his preferences, and his personality traits that they couldn't recall sharing with her. When Amanda mentioned Ethan's unusual fear of thunderstorms, Sarah nodded knowingly and explained it stemmed from a traumatic experience when he was very young. Amanda was certain she had never told Sarah about the incident that occurred when Ethan was barely 2 years old, before many of his own conscious memories had formed. The hospital's pharmacy department was the first to document concrete evidence that something was amiss. In late November, the lead pharmacist, Robert Chen, noticed minor discrepancies in the controlled substance inventory for the pediatric oncology ward. Small quantities of pain medications and sedatives showed inconsistencies between what was dispensed and what was documented as administered to patients. The gaps were minimal, perhaps a few milliliters here and there, but the pattern was consistent enough to warrant investigation. Robert brought his concerns to Catherine Reynolds, who began a discreet internal review. The timing of the discrepancies aligned closely with Sarah Mitchell's shifts. Catherine knew Sarah's reputation as a model employee, someone who had received multiple commendations for excellent patient care. The idea that Sarah might be diverting medications seemed almost impossible, yet the numbers didn't lie. Catherine faced a difficult decision: confront a valued employee based on preliminary evidence, or conduct a more thorough investigation that might reveal nothing at all. As Catherine delved deeper into Sarah's recent activities, she discovered something unexpected. The hospital's billing department had received several anonymous payments over the past months, specifically designated to cover portions of Ethan Roberts' medical expenses that weren't covered by insurance. The payments were substantial, totaling several $1,000s, and they arrived like clockwork every 2 weeks. The payment method was always the same: cashier's checks purchased from different banks across the Portland metropolitan area, making them nearly impossible to trace back to a specific individual. Catherine cross-referenced the dates of these anonymous payments with Sarah's work schedule. The correlation was striking. The checks were consistently purchased on Sarah's days off from banks located near her apartment. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Why would a nurse making a modest salary be making significant financial contributions to a patient's family? And if Sarah was indeed the anonymous donor, where was she getting the money? The situation became more complex when Catherine reviewed Sarah's personnel file and discovered something she had overlooked. Sarah had requested a transfer to the pediatric oncology ward in June 2023, just weeks before Ethan Roberts was admitted. Her previous assignment had been in the cardiac care unit, where she had worked successfully for 3 years. The transfer request had been approved without much scrutiny, as the pediatric oncology ward was perpetually short-staffed, and Sarah's qualifications were excellent. But the timing now seemed more than coincidental. Catherine decided to access the hospital's security footage, a step she took reluctantly, knowing it represented a significant invasion of Sarah's privacy. The recordings revealed that Sarah frequently arrived at the hospital hours before her scheduled shifts, going directly to the medical records department. The footage showed her at computer terminals, apparently reviewing files, though the camera angles didn't reveal which records she was accessing. This behavior had been ongoing since her transfer to the pediatric ward. On the evening of December 14th, Catherine made the decision to confront Sarah about the medication discrepancies and the anonymous payments. However, before she could arrange a formal meeting, she received an urgent call from the night shift supervisor. Sarah had been found in the hospital's chapel at 2 a.m, long after her shift had ended. She wasn't praying or resting. She was sitting in the darkness, holding a folder filled with newspaper clippings, photographs, and documents. When the security guard approached her, Sarah quickly gathered the materials and left the chapel without explanation. Catherine retrieved the security footage from the chapel. Though the image quality was poor in the dim lighting, she could make out some of the papers Sarah had been examining. One appeared to be a newspaper article with a headline about a fatal car accident. Another looked like a birth certificate or adoption document. Catherine felt a chill of recognition. She had seen similar cases before, situations where personal connections between staff and patients created complicated ethical dilemmas. The next morning, Catherine requested access to Sarah Mitchell's complete employment history and background check. What she found confirmed her growing suspicions. 9 years earlier, in 2014, Sarah had taken a 6-month leave of absence from her previous employer, a hospital in Salem, Oregon. The reason listed was personal medical leave. Catherine's years of experience told her this was a significant piece of the puzzle, but she needed more information to understand how it connected to Ethan Roberts and Sarah's current behavior. As December progressed and the holiday season approached, Sarah's physical and emotional state continued to deteriorate. She was losing weight, her hands trembled slightly during medication administration, and several colleagues reported seeing her crying in the staff bathroom. Yet she refused to take time off, insisting she needed to be there for Ethan, whose condition had become increasingly precarious. His latest round of chemotherapy had triggered severe complications, and his doctors were running out of treatment options. Catherine knew she couldn't delay any longer. Whatever was driving Sarah Mitchell's extraordinary dedication to Ethan Roberts, whatever connection existed between them, it was time to bring it into the light. The medication discrepancies, the anonymous payments, The secret research into hospital records, the emotional attachment that went far beyond professional boundaries. All of these pieces pointed to a truth that Catherine suspected would shake the foundations of everything. The hospital administration thought they understood about one of their most dedicated nurses. On December 18th, Catherine scheduled a mandatory meeting with Sarah Mitchell for the following day. She prepared a file containing all the evidence she had gathered, the pharmacy reports, the security footage, the payment records, and the timeline that connected Sarah's transfer request to Ethan's admission. But as Catherine organized the documents late that evening, her phone rang. It was the night supervisor calling with news that would accelerate everything. Sarah Mitchell had just been found accessing restricted medical records in the hospital's archive room, records that dated back nearly a decade. And the name on those files was one that Catherine recognized from her earlier research into the fatal car accident Sarah had been reading about in the chapel. The truth was about to emerge, but Catherine had no idea just how deep the connection ran, or how Sarah's secret would ultimately challenge every assumption about the boundaries between professional duty and personal redemption. January 8, 2024. The new year had brought no respite to Portland Memorial Hospital's growing crisis. What had begun as minor inventory discrepancies had evolved into a full-scale internal investigation that threatened to expose secrets buried for nearly a decade. The pediatric oncology ward, usually a place of hope despite the difficult battles fought within its walls, had become the center of an administrative inquiry that grew more complex with each passing day. Catherine Reynolds sat in her office, reviewing the evidence she had compiled over the past 3 weeks. The director of nursing had spent over 20 years in healthcare administration, and her instincts told her this case was unlike any she had encountered. The medication discrepancies weren't following the typical pattern of substance abuse or black market diversion. The amounts were too small, too precisely calculated, and the missing medications were an unusual combination of pain management drugs and anti-anxiety medications rather than the high-value narcotics that typically attracted attention. Benjamin Clark, the hospital's director of security, had joined Catherine's investigation in early January. Benjamin was a former police detective who had transitioned to hospital security after retiring from the Portland Police Bureau. His methodical approach to evidence gathering had already uncovered several critical details that Catherine had missed. Together, they had constructed a timeline that painted a disturbing picture of Sarah Mitchell's activities over the past 6 months. The security footage from various locations throughout the hospital revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond dedicated patient care. Sarah was accessing the medical records system during breaks, sometimes for hours at a time. Benjamin's forensic review of the digital access logs showed that Sarah had viewed files relating to organ donation, bone marrow transplants, and adoption records, none of which had any direct relevance to her current duties as a pediatric oncology nurse. What particularly troubled Benjamin was Sarah's interest in a specific case from 2014. The digital logs showed she had accessed files related to an infant patient who had received an emergency bone marrow transplant. The child's name was redacted in the logs due to privacy protections, but the case details were distinctive. The infant had been critically ill, requiring an emergency transplant from an anonymous donor after being injured in the same accident that killed his biological mother. Catherine had meanwhile been investigating the anonymous payments being made toward Ethan Roberts' medical expenses. Working with the hospital's billing department and legal counsel, she had traced the cashier's checks back to their sources. Each check had been purchased with cash at different bank branches throughout the Portland area, a clear attempt to avoid creating a traceable pattern. However, security cameras at several of these banks had captured images of the person making the purchases. The footage was grainy, but the individual's general appearance matched Sarah Mitchell's build and height. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Catherine received a call from the hospital's chief financial officer. An audit of the pediatric oncology ward's discretionary fund had revealed that someone with administrative access had been making unauthorized transfers. Small amounts, never more than a few $100s at a time, had been moved from the fund into what appeared to be a personal account. The transactions had been cleverly disguised as legitimate operational expenses, but the audit had caught the irregularities. Catherine felt a sinking sensation as she reviewed the transfer records. The account receiving the funds was registered under a name she didn't recognize, but the routing information led to a credit union where Sarah Mitchell was a member. The transferred money totaled nearly $8,000 over the past 5 months. Combined with the anonymous payments to the Roberts family, Sarah appeared to have diverted or donated over $15,000, an amount that seemed impossible on a nurse's salary, especially one who was already working excessive overtime hours. Benjamin suggested they examine Sarah's financial records, but Catherine hesitated. Such an investigation would require involving law enforcement and potentially filing formal charges. Once that threshold was crossed, there would be no going back. Sarah would likely lose her nursing license, face criminal prosecution, and carry the stigma of theft and fraud for the rest of her life. Catherine wanted to understand the full picture before taking such irreversible steps. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the pediatric oncologist overseeing Ethan Roberts' care, requested a meeting with Catherine. Jennifer had become concerned about Sarah's emotional state and her increasingly frequent questions about Ethan's prognosis and treatment options. During one particularly intense conversation, Sarah had mentioned something that struck Jennifer as odd. Sarah had referenced specific details about Ethan's medical history from infancy, information that wasn't in his current hospital records because it predated his adoption by the Roberts family. Jennifer had done her own quiet investigation, pulling Ethan's complete medical history from the Regional Health Information Exchange. The records revealed that Ethan had been treated at Portland Memorial Hospital as an infant in 2014, following the car accident that killed his biological mother. He had suffered severe injuries and developed a life-threatening infection that destroyed his bone marrow. An emergency donor search had found a compatible match, and the transplant had been performed successfully. The child had then been placed with foster care and eventually adopted by Michael and Amanda Roberts. Catherine listened to Jennifer's findings with growing understanding. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed raised more questions than it answered. If Sarah had some connection to Ethan's past, why would she hide it? Why not disclose the relationship to the hospital administration and request appropriate accommodation? And more pressingly, what explained the financial irregularities and medication discrepancies? Benjamin decided to expand the investigation beyond the hospital's walls. He contacted several of Sarah's former colleagues at the Salem Hospital, where she had worked before transferring to Portland Memorial. One former supervisor remembered Sarah well and recalled the 6-month leave she had taken in 2014. The supervisor had assumed it was for a medical procedure, but Sarah had been vague about the details. When she returned to work, she seemed changed, more withdrawn, more serious, less engaged with her colleagues. The supervisor also remembered something else. Around the time Sarah returned to work, there had been news coverage of a fatal accident on Interstate 5 near Salem. A young woman named Lisa Henderson had died when her vehicle was struck by a drunk driver. The victim had been only 26 years old, and she left behind an infant son who was critically injured in the crash. The supervisor couldn't be certain, but she thought she remembered Sarah being particularly affected by the news, keeping newspaper clippings about the accident in her locker. Catherine obtained copies of the news articles about Lisa Henderson's death. The reports described the tragedy in detail. A promising young life cut short, a baby left orphaned and fighting for survival, a drunk driver who showed no remorse. The articles mentioned that the infant, whose name was withheld for privacy, required extensive medical treatment, including a bone marrow transplant. The donor had been anonymous, as was standard in such cases, and the transplant had ultimately saved the child's life. Benjamin pulled Sarah Mitchell's personnel file and compared it to the news articles. Sarah's leave of absence began just weeks before Lisa Henderson's death. The timing seemed more than coincidental. Benjamin suggested running a background check to see if there was any connection between Sarah and Lisa Henderson. Catherine authorized the search, knowing they were approaching the point where they would need to involve hospital administration and potentially legal authorities. The background check revealed the truth that Catherine had begun to suspect. Sarah Mitchell and Lisa Henderson were sisters. Lisa was 5 years younger than Sarah, and according to public records, the two had been estranged for several years before Lisa's death. Court documents showed that Lisa had struggled with substance abuse issues and had briefly lost custody of her infant son to Child Protective Services. During that period, the child had been placed with extended family, specifically with Lisa's older sister Sarah, who had served as a temporary guardian. The medical leave Sarah had taken in 2014 aligned precisely with the timeline of Lisa's custody case. Catherine cross-referenced the dates and discovered that Sarah had undergone a medical procedure during her leave, a bone marrow donation. The hospital's own records, buried in archives, confirmed that Sarah Mitchell had been the anonymous donor who saved Ethan Roberts' life when he was just 8 months old. The revelation transformed Catherine's understanding of the entire situation. Sarah wasn't just a dedicated nurse caring for a random patient. She was a biological aunt watching over her sister's son, a child she had helped save through her own tissue donation, a nephew who had been adopted by another family and likely had no knowledge of his biological connections. The emotional weight of such a secret explained much of Sarah's behavior, but it didn't address the financial improprieties or the medication discrepancies. Benjamin continued his investigation of the missing medications, now viewing the evidence through a different lens. He discovered that Sarah had been using her employee access to purchase medications at employee discounted rates, but not for personal use. Hospital security footage showed her meeting with other staff members in the parking lot, exchanging small packages. At first, Benjamin suspected she was selling drugs, but further investigation revealed something different. Several nurses and medical technicians from different departments had been purchasing medications from Sarah at cost, bypassing the hospital pharmacy's markup. These were staff members struggling with medical bills for family members, unable to afford prescriptions even with their health insurance. Sarah had been operating an informal assistance program, using her employee privileges to help colleagues in financial distress. She then donated all the money she collected directly to Ethan's medical fund, essentially using the hospital as an unwitting intermediary for charity. The unauthorized transfers from the discretionary fund told a similar story. Sarah had been moving money to an account she had set up specifically to collect donations for families in the pediatric oncology ward facing financial hardship. The account's name belonged to a non-profit organization that Sarah had registered shortly after transferring to the pediatric ward. Every dollar that went into the account came back out as anonymous payments to families like the Roberts, who were drowning in medical debt despite having insurance. Catherine found herself facing an ethical dilemma that had no clear resolution. Sarah had violated hospital policies, diverted controlled substances, and manipulated financial systems for unauthorized purposes. By every standard of hospital administration and healthcare law, her actions constituted serious misconduct that warranted termination and likely criminal prosecution. Yet her intentions had been entirely altruistic, and the beneficiaries of her actions were vulnerable families and a desperately ill child to whom she had biological ties. Michael and Amanda Roberts remained unaware of any investigation or controversy surrounding their son's primary nurse. They continued to be grateful for Sarah's extraordinary dedication to Ethan's care. Amanda had even mentioned to the hospital's patient liaison that Sarah seemed almost like family. So intuitive was her understanding of Ethan's needs, and so genuine her concern for his well-being. The irony of that observation was not lost on Catherine. As January progressed, Ethan's medical condition deteriorated significantly. His body was rejecting the latest chemotherapy protocol, and his doctors were running out of options. The oncology team began discussing the possibility of another bone marrow transplant, though finding a compatible donor would be challenging given Ethan's rare tissue markers. During one team meeting, Dr. Martinez casually mentioned that Ethan's original transplant donor from infancy would likely still be a match if they could be located and willing to donate again. Catherine listened to this conversation with the weight of her investigation pressing down on her. She knew exactly where Ethan's original donor was, working double shifts in the same ward, exhausting herself physically and financially to support the nephew she couldn't acknowledge. The question was what to do with this knowledge. Hospital policy was clear about conflicts of interest and undisclosed personal relationships in patient care. Sarah had violated fundamental principles of healthcare ethics by concealing her connection to Ethan. Benjamin completed his investigation and prepared a comprehensive report for hospital administration. The document laid out every irregularity, the medication diversions, the financial transfers, the undisclosed personal relationship, the unauthorized access to medical records. The evidence was damning, and Benjamin's professional opinion was unambiguous. Sarah Mitchell had engaged in conduct that warranted immediate termination and referral to law enforcement and the state nursing board. Catherine reviewed the report and added her own analysis. She included the context that Benjamin's law enforcement background had caused him to overlook, the desperate circumstances of families facing catastrophic medical bills, the inadequacy of insurance coverage for pediatric cancer treatment, and the moral complexity of judging someone who had broken rules to help others rather than enrich herself. Catherine's recommendation was more nuanced than Benjamin's, but she acknowledged that Sarah's actions could not go unaddressed regardless of their motivation. On January 22nd, the hospital's executive leadership team met to discuss the Sarah Mitchell situation. The chief executive officer, the chief medical officer, the general counsel, Catherine, and Benjamin all participated in the closed-door session. The meeting lasted for 3 hours as the administrators debated how to handle a case that had no precedent in the hospital's history. The legal counsel warned that taking no action could expose the hospital to liability if Sarah's conduct became public knowledge. The chief medical officer argued that losing a nurse of Sarah's caliber would be a significant blow to the pediatric oncology program. The executive team ultimately decided that they could not make a final decision without hearing directly from Sarah Mitchell. Catherine was authorized to conduct a formal interview, with the understanding that Sarah's responses would determine whether the matter would be resolved internally or referred to external authorities. The interview was scheduled for January 29th, giving Catherine 1 week to prepare questions and giving Sarah formal notice that her conduct was under review. When Sarah received the notification of the investigatory interview, her reaction surprised her colleagues. Rather than appearing defensive or anxious, she seemed almost relieved. She told the nurse manager that she had been expecting this conversation for months and was grateful it was finally happening. Her only request was that the interview not interfere with Ethan's care schedule. She wanted to ensure he wouldn't be left without proper attention during a critical phase of his treatment. Catherine spent the days before the interview reviewing every piece of evidence one more time. She wanted to understand not just what Sarah had done, but why she had made the choices that led to this moment. The picture that emerged was of a woman trapped between competing moral obligations, the duty to follow institutional rules and the duty to care for a child she had already saved once at great personal cost. It was a dilemma that Catherine knew would have broken many people, yet Sarah had somehow continued functioning, even thriving professionally, while carrying this enormous burden alone. The night before the scheduled interview, Catherine received an urgent call from the pediatric oncology ward. Ethan Roberts had suffered a sudden crisis. His weakened immune system had failed to fight off an infection, and he had been rushed to the intensive care unit. His condition was critical, and the doctors were unsure if he would survive the night. Sarah had been at his bedside when the crisis occurred, and she had been the first to recognize the subtle signs that something was catastrophically wrong. Her quick response had likely saved Ethan's life, at least temporarily. Catherine went to the hospital, knowing the interview would have to be postponed, but feeling compelled to witness whatever was unfolding. She found Sarah in the ICU family waiting room, sitting with Michael and Amanda Roberts. Sarah's face was streaked with tears, but she was holding Amanda's hand and speaking to her in low, comforting tones. Michael stood nearby, his expression devastated, staring through the window at his son's bed, where machines and monitors fought to keep the 8-year-old alive. As Catherine watched this scene, she realized that whatever administrative decision came out of the investigation, whatever penalties were imposed or policies enforced, the human reality of the situation transcended institutional procedures. Sarah Mitchell had crossed lines that should not be crossed, violated rules that existed for good reasons, and created an ethical mess that would take months to untangle. Yet in this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be, supporting a family through their darkest hour, drawing on reserves of strength and compassion that seemed impossible given her own exhaustion. Catherine knew the interview would still happen, the investigation would conclude, and decisions would be made. But she also knew that the truth waiting to be revealed would challenge everyone's assumptions about right and wrong, rules and compassion, professional boundaries, and human connection. The deeper they dug into Sarah Mitchell's story, the more they would confront uncomfortable questions about what it meant to truly care for patients in a healthcare system that sometimes seemed designed to prevent genuine human connection. The investigation had begun with medication discrepancies and financial irregularities. It would end with revelations that would force Portland Memorial Hospital to reconsider everything it thought it knew about the relationship between nurses and patients, and the price some people were willing to pay to honor debts that could never truly be repaid. February 2, 2024. Portland Memorial Hospital remained under the shadow of an investigation that had grown far beyond its initial scope. What began as a routine audit of medication inventories had evolved into a complex examination of professional ethics, personal sacrifice, and the blurred boundaries between duty and devotion. The Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, where 8-year-old Ethan Roberts fought for survival, had become the unexpected epicenter of a revelation that would challenge fundamental assumptions about healthcare relationships. Ethan had survived the critical night of January 28th, though his condition remained precarious. The infection that had nearly claimed his life was slowly responding to aggressive antibiotic treatment. But his already compromised immune system had been pushed to its absolute limits. His medical team understood that without significant intervention, likely another bone marrow transplant, his chances of long-term survival were diminishing with each passing day. Catherine Reynolds had postponed the formal interview with Sarah Mitchell, recognizing that confronting the nurse during such a crisis would be both inhumane and counterproductive. However, the delay had given Catherine additional time to pursue a line of investigation that Benjamin Clark had suggested, examining the historical records of bone marrow donations processed through Portland Memorial Hospital in 2014. The hospital's tissue bank maintained meticulous records of all organ and tissue donations, including bone marrow transplants. These records were heavily protected by privacy regulations, requiring special authorization to access. Catherine worked with the hospital's legal counsel to obtain the necessary permissions, arguing that understanding the full context of Sarah's relationship with Ethan was essential to making appropriate administrative decisions. The records revealed details that transformed Catherine's understanding of the case entirely. In March 2014, Sarah Mitchell had undergone a bone marrow donation procedure at Portland Memorial Hospital. The recipient was an 8-month-old infant identified only by a patient number, consistent with standard privacy protocols for anonymous donations. However, cross-referencing the patient number with archived medical records confirmed what Catherine had already suspected. The recipient was Ethan Roberts, though he carried a different surname at the time, before his adoption was finalized. What Catherine had not anticipated was the complexity of Sarah's donation process. The medical records showed that Sarah had undergone extensive compatibility testing, requiring multiple procedures over several weeks. The donation itself had been more complicated than typical because Sarah's bone marrow had contained unusually high concentrations of stem cells, making her an exceptionally valuable match for the critically ill infant. The procedure had required Sarah to undergo additional preparation and recovery time, explaining the extended medical leave she had taken from her previous employer. The records also contained documentation that Catherine found deeply troubling. Sarah had signed extensive legal waivers acknowledging that as an anonymous donor, she would have no claim to future contact with the recipient and no right to information about the recipient's identity or medical progress. These documents were standard in the organ donation system, designed to protect both donors and recipients from complicated emotional entanglements. Sarah had willfully violated these agreements by tracking down her nephew and maneuvering herself into a position to provide his ongoing care. Benjamin Clark had meanwhile been investigating the financial aspects of Sarah's situation with renewed focus. He had traced her income and expenses over the past 6 months, constructing a detailed picture of her financial sacrifice. Sarah's base nursing salary was approximately $65,000 annually. The overtime shifts she had been working increased her gross income by nearly 40%, bringing her to roughly $90,000 before taxes. However, her actual take-home pay after taxes, retirement contributions, and insurance premiums was significantly less. Benjamin's forensic accounting revealed that Sarah had been living on an extraordinarily tight budget. Her apartment rent consumed nearly half her take-home pay, a common problem in Portland's expensive housing market. She had sold her car 6 months earlier, relying on public transportation to save on insurance and maintenance costs. Her bank records showed minimal spending on food, entertainment, or personal items. Every extra dollar was being funneled into 2 channels: the cashier's checks sent anonymously to the Roberts family, and the unauthorized transfers supporting other families in the pediatric oncology ward. The medication diversion scheme was more sophisticated than initially apparent. Benjamin discovered that Sarah had been collaborating, perhaps unknowingly, with a network of hospital employees facing similar financial pressures. She had positioned herself as a facilitator, using her pharmacy access to obtain medications at employee discount rates and then distributing them to colleagues at cost. The colleagues included single parents struggling with childcare expenses, employees with sick relatives, and staff members dealing with their own medical issues. None of them had been profiting from the arrangement. They were simply trying to afford necessary medications in a healthcare system where even insured employees faced prohibitive prescription costs. Sarah had not been keeping any money from these transactions for herself. Every dollar collected went directly into the nonprofit account she had established for pediatric oncology families. The scale of her operation was modest. Perhaps $5,000 had moved through this channel over 6 months. But the legal implications were serious. She had effectively been operating an unlicensed pharmacy distribution system, regardless of her charitable intentions. Catherine obtained records of the nonprofit organization Sarah had registered. The entity was called the Henderson Foundation, named after Sarah's deceased sister Lisa. The organization's stated mission was to provide financial assistance to families of pediatric cancer patients facing medical expenses not covered by insurance. Sarah was listed as the foundation's sole director and administrator. The organization had no other employees, no board of directors, and operated entirely through Sarah's personal efforts. The foundation's financial records, which Sarah was legally required to maintain, showed exactly where every donated dollar had gone. The Roberts family had received the largest portion, nearly $12,000 over 6 months, but 11 other families had also received assistance ranging from $500 to $2,000 each. The payments had covered medication copays, travel expenses for families coming from outside Portland, temporary housing for parents staying near the hospital, and even basic necessities like food and clothing for siblings of hospitalized children. Catherine discovered something else in Sarah's foundation records that provided crucial context. Sarah had been soliciting donations from her former colleagues, friends, and extended family members. She had written dozens of emails and letters explaining Ethan's situation, though never identifying him by name or revealing her biological connection, and asking for financial support. Some people had contributed small amounts, but the majority of the foundation's funds had come from Sarah's own earnings. Dr. Jennifer Martinez had been conducting her own parallel investigation, driven by medical rather than administrative concerns. She had been reviewing Ethan's complete medical history, trying to identify any factors that might improve his treatment options. During this review, Jennifer made a discovery that would prove crucial to the unfolding crisis. Ethan's tissue typing from his original 2014 transplant showed a rare combination of genetic markers. Finding a compatible donor for his current needs would be exceptionally difficult through the National Bone Marrow Registry. However, Jennifer's analysis indicated that Ethan's original donor would still be a near-perfect match. The problem was that anonymous donors were under no obligation to donate again, and the registry system protected donor identities precisely to prevent recipients or their families from pressuring donors for additional donations. Jennifer brought this information to Catherine during a private meeting in early February. The oncologist explained that Ethan's best chance of survival would be a second donation from the same donor who had saved him as an infant. Without identifying Sarah by name, Jennifer asked whether the hospital's investigation might reveal the identity of Ethan's original donor. Catherine faced an impossible ethical dilemma. She knew exactly who the donor was, but revealing that information would violate Sarah's privacy and potentially expose the hospital to legal liability. The situation became more urgent on February 8th, when Ethan's medical team determined that another bone marrow transplant was not just advisable, but necessary. Without it, Ethan would likely not survive beyond a few months. Michael and Amanda Roberts were informed that the search for a compatible donor would begin immediately, but that the chances of finding a match quickly enough were uncertain. The couple faced the terrifying possibility of watching their son die while waiting for a donor who might never be found. Catherine knew she could not delay the formal interview with Sarah any longer. The administrative investigation had been overshadowed by Ethan's medical crisis, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. More importantly, Catherine now understood that Sarah might be the key to saving Ethan's life a second time. The question was whether Sarah would be willing to undergo another donation, and whether the hospital could ethically facilitate such a donation given the violations Sarah had already committed. Benjamin had completed his investigative report and submitted it to the hospital's executive leadership. His conclusions were damning from a legal standpoint. Sarah had violated hospital policies on multiple fronts: unauthorized access to medical records, diversion of controlled substances, financial improprieties, and failure to disclose a personal relationship that created an obvious conflict of interest. Benjamin recommended immediate termination, referral to the state nursing board for license suspension, and consideration of criminal charges for the medication diversion. Catherine submitted her own report, which acknowledged all the same facts but interpreted them through a different lens. She emphasized Sarah's altruistic motivations, the absence of personal financial gain, and the exceptional quality of patient care Sarah had provided despite her ethical violations. Catherine recommended a suspension pending further review, mandatory ethics training, strict oversight if Sarah were allowed to return to work, and a comprehensive review of hospital policies to address the systemic issues that had led Sarah to take matters into her own hands. The executive leadership team met again on February 12th to review both reports and make a final determination. The meeting was contentious, with administrators divided between those who felt rules must be enforced regardless of circumstances and those who believed Sarah's situation warranted leniency. The hospital's general counsel pointed out that treating Sarah too harshly might create public relations problems if the full story became known, while treating her too leniently might expose the hospital to accusations of condoning illegal behavior. The debate was interrupted by an emergency call from the pediatric ICU. Ethan Roberts had suffered another severe setback. His body was shutting down, and his doctors estimated he had perhaps weeks rather than months to live. The National Bone Marrow Registry had not yet identified any potential donors. Michael and Amanda Roberts were being prepared for the likelihood that their son would die before a suitable donor could be found. Catherine made a decision that she knew could cost her own career. She called Sarah Mitchell directly and asked her to come to the hospital immediately for the postponed interview. When Sarah arrived, still wearing the exhausted expression that had become her constant companion, Catherine did something unprecedented. Before beginning the formal interview, she informed Sarah that Ethan needed another bone marrow donation and that Sarah was likely his only realistic hope for survival. Sarah's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. She would donate again without hesitation, regardless of any consequences she might face for her previous conduct. She had saved Ethan once and would do everything in her power to save him again. The question was whether Portland Memorial Hospital would facilitate the donation, knowing it would mean acknowledging Sarah's biological relationship to Ethan and potentially exposing the institution to claims that it had knowingly allowed an improper care relationship to continue. Catherine informed Sarah that before any decisions could be made about the donation, they needed to conduct the formal interview about her conduct over the past 6 months. Sarah agreed, and for the next 3 hours, she provided a complete and honest account of everything she had done. She explained her motivations, acknowledged her violations of hospital policy, and accepted full responsibility for her choices. She made no excuses and asked for no leniency. Her only concern was ensuring that Ethan received the transplant he needed. The interview revealed additional details that Catherine had not previously known. Sarah explained that when her sister Lisa died in 2014, Sarah had been serving as temporary guardian for 8-month-old Ethan, while Lisa went through court-ordered substance abuse treatment. Sarah had been the one who cared for Ethan after the accident, had undergone compatibility testing when the baby needed a bone marrow donor, and had donated her bone marrow to save his life. When Ethan was placed for adoption, Sarah had been given the option to adopt him herself, but had declined, believing she was not equipped to raise a child alone while working full-time as a nurse. The decision to let Ethan be adopted by another family had haunted Sarah for 9 years. She had tried to move on with her life, but she could never completely let go of the nephew she had saved. When she learned through a chance encounter with a social worker friend that Ethan had been diagnosed with leukemia and was being treated at Portland Memorial Hospital, Sarah had immediately requested a transfer. She had told herself she would just check on him from a distance, ensure he was receiving good care, and then step back. Instead, she had become increasingly involved, unable to resist the pull of connection to the child who carried her sister's genes and her own bone marrow. Sarah's account of the financial assistance she had provided to the Roberts family and other families was particularly revealing. She explained that watching families struggle with medical bills while their children fought for survival had become unbearable. She had initially intended to help only Ethan's family, but once she established the foundation, other families in desperate need had come to her attention. She had expanded her efforts, knowing she was violating hospital policies, but unable to turn away from people who needed help. The medication diversion had begun almost accidentally. A colleague had confided in Sarah about being unable to afford a prescription for her diabetic mother. Sarah had used her employee discount to purchase the medication and had given it to her colleague at cost. Word had spread among financially struggling staff members, and Sarah had found herself operating an informal assistance program. She had understood the legal risks, but had rationalized that she was helping people afford necessary medications they otherwise could not obtain. Catherine listened to Sarah's complete confession with a mixture of admiration and frustration. Sarah had violated nearly every professional boundary that existed to protect both healthcare workers and patients. Yet her motivations had been entirely selfless, and the beneficiaries of her actions had been vulnerable people whom the healthcare system had failed. Catherine faced the reality that disciplining Sarah would be administratively correct but morally ambiguous. The interview concluded late in the evening of February 12th. Catherine informed Sarah that she would be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a final decision by the hospital's executive leadership. Sarah was barred from patient care activities, but was told that the hospital would facilitate her potential bone marrow donation to Ethan if she consented, and if the medical team determined it was clinically appropriate. Sarah agreed to all conditions without protest. Catherine spent the next several days preparing her final recommendation to the executive leadership team. She knew that whatever decision was made about Sarah's employment status, the larger questions raised by this case would require systemic changes. The hospital needed better mechanisms for supporting financially distressed families. The healthcare system needed to address the reality that even insured patients faced crushing medical expenses. And the policies governing professional boundaries needed to account for the complexity of human relationships in healthcare settings. On February 16th, Sarah underwent preliminary medical evaluation to determine her suitability as a bone marrow donor for Ethan. The tests confirmed what Dr. Martinez had predicted. Sarah remained an excellent match, and a second donation was medically feasible. The more complicated question was whether the hospital would approve the procedure given Sarah's employment status and the unresolved ethics investigation. Michael and Amanda Roberts had still not been informed of Sarah's biological relationship to their son. They knew only that a potential donor had been identified and was undergoing evaluation. The hospital's legal counsel had advised that the Roberts family must be informed of Sarah's identity before the donation could proceed, as they had the right to refuse a donation from someone with undisclosed personal connections to their child. This disclosure would inevitably reveal everything that Sarah had been hiding for 6 months. Catherine scheduled a meeting with the Roberts family for February 19th. She prepared comprehensive documentation of everything the investigation had revealed, knowing that the Roberts family deserved complete transparency. The meeting would be one of the most difficult conversations of Catherine's career, requiring her to explain that the nurse they had trusted with their son's care had been operating under false pretenses, while also making clear that Sarah's deception had been motivated by love rather than malice. The night before the scheduled meeting, Catherine received a call that changed everything once again. The hospital's chief executive officer informed her that the state nursing board had received an anonymous complaint about Sarah Mitchell's conduct. Someone, possibly a disgruntled hospital employee who had learned about the investigation, had reported Sarah's medication diversion to regulatory authorities. The nursing board had opened its own investigation and had issued an emergency order suspending Sarah's nursing license pending a formal hearing. The suspension meant that Sarah was no longer legally authorized to work as a nurse in Oregon. However, it did not affect her ability to donate bone marrow as a private citizen. The executive leadership team convened an emergency meeting to determine how to proceed. They faced a scenario none of them had anticipated. Their investigation had been overtaken by external regulatory action, and the nurse at the center of the controversy was now facing career-ending consequences that might prevent the bone marrow donation that could save Ethan's life. Catherine understood that the revelation awaiting Michael and Amanda Roberts would be shocking and painful. They would learn that the nurse who had cared so devotedly for their son was actually his biological aunt, that she had concealed this relationship for months, that she had engaged in conduct that violated hospital policies and state laws, and that she was now facing professional sanctions that might end her nursing career. Yet in the midst of all this devastating news, there would be one crucial piece of hope. Sarah was willing and able to donate bone marrow again, potentially saving Ethan's life for the second time. The truth was about to emerge in its full, complicated reality. And once it did, nothing would ever be the same for Sarah Mitchell, the Roberts family, or Portland Memorial Hospital. February 19th, 2024. The conference room on the administrative floor of Portland Memorial Hospital felt oppressively small despite its spacious dimensions. Catherine Reynolds sat at the head of the table, organized folders and documents spread before her, each containing information that would shatter the Roberts family's understanding of the past 6 months. Through the window, gray Portland rain fell steadily, matching the somber mood of what was about to unfold. Michael and Amanda Roberts arrived precisely on time, their faces showing the strain of weeks spent watching their son fight for survival. They had been told only that the meeting concerned an important development in Ethan's care, and that it required their immediate attention. Amanda carried a worn notebook where she had been tracking every detail of Ethan's treatment, a desperate attempt to maintain some sense of control over an increasingly uncontrollable situation. Michael's hand rested protectively on his wife's shoulder as they took seats across from Catherine. Benjamin Clark attended the meeting in his capacity as security director, present to document the disclosure and answer any questions about the investigation's findings. Dr. Jennifer Martinez was also there, ready to explain the medical aspects of the potential bone marrow donation. The hospital's legal counsel, Daniel Wright, sat quietly in the corner, present to ensure that all disclosures were made appropriately and to address any legal concerns the Roberts family might raise. Catherine began by explaining that the hospital had conducted an internal investigation into certain irregularities in the pediatric oncology ward. She emphasized that the investigation had not been triggered by any concerns about the quality of Ethan's medical care, which had been exemplary throughout his treatment. Rather, the inquiry had focused on administrative and policy matters that had come to light through routine auditing procedures. Michael and Amanda listened with growing confusion as Catherine described the medication inventory discrepancies, the unauthorized financial transactions, and the discovery of undisclosed personal relationships between staff and patients. Amanda's grip on her notebook tightened as she began to realize that the investigation somehow involved their son. Michael interrupted to ask directly whether Ethan's treatment had been compromised in any way. Catherine assured them it had not, but acknowledged that the situation was complex and would require considerable explanation. Catherine then began the difficult process of revealing Sarah Mitchell's true identity and her connection to Ethan. She started with the historical facts: the car accident in 2014 that killed Lisa Henderson, the critical injuries suffered by Lisa's infant son, and the emergency bone marrow transplant that saved the baby's life. Michael and Amanda knew this history, as Ethan's adoption records included basic information about his biological mother's death and his early medical challenges. What the Roberts family had never known was the identity of the anonymous bone marrow donor who saved their son's life. Catherine explained that the donor had been Lisa Henderson's older sister, Sarah Mitchell, who had been serving as temporary guardian for the infant at the time of the accident. Sarah had undergone compatibility testing and had donated her bone marrow to save her nephew when he was just 8 months old. Following the donation, the baby had been placed for adoption, and Sarah had signed legal documents acknowledging she would have no future contact with him. The revelation hit Amanda with visible force. Her face went pale as she processed the information that the nurse who had been caring for Ethan with such extraordinary dedication was actually his biological aunt. Michael's expression shifted from confusion to anger as he began to understand the implications. Sarah had known exactly who Ethan was from the moment she began working with him, yet she had never disclosed this crucial information to the family or the hospital administration. Catherine continued with the full disclosure, explaining how Sarah had learned of Ethan's leukemia diagnosis and his treatment at Portland Memorial Hospital. Sarah had requested a transfer to the pediatric oncology ward specifically to be near Ethan. Over the following 6 months, she had worked excessive overtime hours, provided financial assistance to the Roberts family through anonymous donations, and had essentially devoted her entire life to Ethan's care while maintaining the fiction that he was simply one of many patients under her supervision. Amanda struggled to process this information through the lens of her experience with Sarah over the past months. She recalled dozens of interactions that now took on new meaning, the way Sarah seemed to anticipate Ethan's needs before they were expressed, her emotional investment in his treatment outcomes, and her seemingly intuitive understanding of his personality and preferences. What Amanda had interpreted as extraordinary nursing skill had actually been the actions of a biological relative who had been watching over Ethan since infancy. Michael's anger intensified as Catherine described the extent of Sarah's deception. He demanded to know why the hospital had allowed this situation to continue once it came to light. Catherine explained that the investigation had only recently uncovered the full truth, and that Sarah had been placed on immediate administrative leave as soon as her identity and conduct were confirmed. She acknowledged that the hospital bore some responsibility for not having systems in place to detect such conflicts of interest earlier. The discussion turned to the financial assistance that Sarah had provided. Catherine explained the Henderson Foundation and how Sarah had been funneling her own earnings and donations from others to help families in the pediatric oncology ward, including the Roberts family. Amanda pulled out her own records, cross-referencing the anonymous payments they had received with the timeline Catherine described. The correlation was exact. Every mysterious cashier's check they had received over the past 6 months had come from Sarah. Michael asked the question that Catherine had been anticipating. Why would Sarah go to such extreme lengths if she had willingly given Ethan up for adoption 9 years earlier? Catherine explained, based on Sarah's interview testimony, that Sarah had been haunted by the decision to let Ethan be adopted. She had believed at the time that she could not adequately care for an infant while working as a full-time nurse and dealing with the grief of her sister's death. The opportunity to be involved in Ethan's life again, even in a limited and concealed capacity, had proven irresistible when she learned of his illness. Dr. Martinez then introduced the medical dimension that made this disclosure even more urgent. She explained that Ethan's current condition required another bone marrow transplant and that finding a compatible donor through the National Registry was proving extremely difficult due to his rare tissue markers. The most likely source of a suitable donation would be his original donor, Sarah Mitchell, who would almost certainly still be a compatible match. The room fell into shocked silence as the Roberts family absorbed this information. The nurse who had deceived them about her identity, who had violated hospital policies and potentially broken laws in her efforts to help their son, was now being presented as Ethan's best hope for survival. Amanda began to cry, overwhelmed by the emotional complexity of learning that the woman she had trusted with her son's care had been his biological aunt all along, and that this same woman might be the only person who could save him now. Michael's anger gave way to a more complicated set of emotions. He acknowledged that regardless of Sarah's deception, she had provided exceptional care for Ethan and had made extraordinary personal sacrifices to support their family. The anonymous financial assistance had been crucial during months when medical bills threatened to bankrupt them. The question was whether they could accept another donation from Sarah given the circumstances, and whether doing so would be enabling behavior that had violated important ethical boundaries. Catherine explained the hospital's position carefully. Sarah had violated multiple policies and had lost her nursing license pending a state board investigation. She faced potential criminal charges for the medication diversion, though no charges had been filed yet. The hospital was still determining what employment action to take, though termination seemed likely. However, none of these consequences affected Sarah's right to donate bone marrow as a private citizen, nor did they diminish her suitability as a donor from a purely medical standpoint. Daniel Wright, the hospital's legal counsel, explained the consent process that would be required if the Roberts family chose to accept a donation from Sarah. They would need to acknowledge in writing that they were aware of Sarah's biological relationship to Ethan and her history of policy violations. They would need to confirm that they were not being pressured or coerced into accepting the donation. And they would need to understand that accepting the donation would likely mean having ongoing contact with Sarah, as bone marrow donors and recipients often developed relationships even when the initial donation was anonymous. Amanda asked whether they could speak with Sarah directly before making any decisions. Catherine had anticipated this request and had arranged for Sarah to be available if the family wished to meet with her. Michael hesitated, uncertain whether such a meeting would be helpful or would only create more emotional confusion. Amanda insisted, arguing that they needed to hear Sarah's explanation in her own words and to understand her motivations before making a decision that would affect Ethan's survival. Sarah was brought to the conference room, escorted by Benjamin Clark as required by her administrative leave conditions. She entered hesitantly, her exhaustion and stress evident in every aspect of her appearance. She had lost weight over the past weeks, her skin was pale, and her eyes showed the effects of chronic sleep deprivation and emotional strain. Yet when she saw Michael and Amanda, her expression shifted to one of deep remorse and genuine concern for their feelings. Catherine facilitated the conversation, ensuring it remained focused on the relevant facts rather than devolving into emotional accusations. Sarah began by offering an unreserved apology for her deception. She acknowledged that her actions had been wrong from a professional and ethical standpoint, regardless of her motivations. She explained that when she learned Ethan was ill and being treated at a hospital where she could potentially work, she had told herself she would simply observe from a distance to ensure he was receiving good care. Sarah described how that initial intention had quickly proven impossible to maintain. Seeing Ethan suffering through chemotherapy, watching Michael and Amanda struggle with the emotional and financial burden of his illness, had reawakened all the feelings she had tried to suppress for 9 years. She had begun working extra shifts to be near him more often. She had started providing financial assistance when she saw the family's distress over medical bills. She had gradually become more involved in his care, crossing professional boundaries that she knew should not be crossed. Amanda asked the question that had been haunting her since Catherine's revelation. Did Sarah regret giving Ethan up for adoption 9 years earlier? Sarah's answer was honest and painful. She explained that she had believed adoption was the right choice at the time, that she had been too young and too overwhelmed with grief to provide adequate care for an infant. She had wanted Ethan to have a stable family with 2 parents who could devote themselves to raising him properly. But yes, she had regretted the decision many times over the years, wondering about the child she had saved and then let go. Michael asked directly whether Sarah had been planning to reveal her identity eventually, or whether she intended to continue her deception indefinitely. Sarah admitted she had no clear plan. She had been living day by day, focused entirely on Ethan's immediate needs, unable to think beyond the next shift or the next treatment cycle. She had known the situation was unsustainable, but had been unable to imagine any resolution that would allow her to remain part of Ethan's life openly. The conversation turned to the potential bone marrow donation. Sarah stated clearly that she would donate without hesitation if the family consented, and if the medical team determined it was appropriate. She understood that the Roberts family had every reason to refuse, given her deception and the violations she had committed. She assured them that her willingness to donate was not contingent on any particular outcome regarding her employment or legal situation. She would donate regardless of whether she ever saw Ethan again, because saving his life was more important than any consequence she might face. Dr. Martinez interjected to explain the medical realities in detail. She described Ethan's deteriorating condition and the urgency of finding a suitable donor. The National Registry search had yielded no compatible matches, and time was running short. A donation from Sarah would need to happen within the next several weeks to have the best chance of success. The procedure would require Sarah to undergo medical evaluation and preparation, and there would be some recovery time afterward. But the risks to Sarah were minimal compared to the potential benefit to Ethan. Amanda asked whether there were any medical reasons why a donation from Sarah might be contraindicated, given the emotional complexity of the situation. Dr. Martinez explained that from a purely medical standpoint, Sarah's biological relationship to Ethan actually made her a better donor than a stranger would be. The emotional factors were relevant, but were ultimately questions for the family to decide rather than medical determinations. Michael requested time to discuss the situation privately with Amanda before making any decisions. Catherine agreed, explaining that there was no immediate urgency for their decision, though Dr. Martinez interjected that from a medical standpoint, resolving the question sooner rather than later would be preferable. Sarah was escorted out of the conference room, leaving the Roberts family to deliberate with Catherine, Dr. Martinez, and Daniel Wright available to answer any additional questions. The deliberation lasted for nearly an hour. Michael and Amanda wrestled with competing considerations: their anger at Sarah's deception, their gratitude for her care and financial support, their concern about the ethical implications of accepting a donation under these circumstances, and above all, their desperate desire to save their son's life. They discussed whether accepting Sarah's donation would obligate them to maintain a relationship with her going forward, and whether such a relationship would be healthy for Ethan given the complicated history. Amanda raised a consideration that others had not explicitly addressed. Ethan himself was old enough to understand and have opinions about his medical treatment. She argued that Ethan deserved to know the truth about Sarah's identity and to have some voice in whether to accept her donation. Michael was more cautious, worried that burdening their son with such complex emotional information while he was critically ill might cause additional stress that could worsen his condition. Dr. Martinez weighed in with a medical perspective. She explained that children Ethan's age often had stronger emotional resilience than adults expected, and that being included in important decisions about their own care could actually reduce anxiety rather than increase it. However, she acknowledged that the timing and manner of such disclosure would need to be carefully considered to minimize trauma. The Roberts family ultimately decided that they needed to consult with Ethan before making a final determination. They wanted him to understand, in age-appropriate terms, that Sarah was his biological aunt and that she had been the one who saved his life when he was a baby. They wanted him to know that she was willing to donate again, and they wanted to gauge his feelings about accepting such a donation. Catherine agreed to facilitate this conversation with support from a hospital child psychologist. Before concluding the meeting, Daniel Wright reviewed the legal implications one final time. He explained that if the family chose to accept Sarah's donation, they would be waiving any claims against the hospital or against Sarah related to her undisclosed relationship and policy violations. The hospital would require this waiver to protect itself from potential liability. Michael and Amanda understood and accepted these terms, recognizing that their priority was Ethan's survival rather than pursuing legal remedies for wrongs that had been committed. The meeting adjourned with an agreement that the conversation with Ethan would occur within the next 48 hours, assuming his medical condition remained stable enough for such a discussion. Sarah would be informed of the family's decision once they had consulted with their son. The hospital would prepare for the potential donation procedure while the family deliberated, ensuring that if they chose to proceed, there would be no unnecessary delays. Catherine returned to her office emotionally drained from the intensity of the disclosure meeting. She had witnessed the Roberts family cycle through shock, anger, confusion, and ultimately a tentative willingness to consider Sarah's donation despite the circumstances. The case had evolved far beyond a simple matter of policy enforcement into a profound examination of what it meant to balance rules and compassion, professional boundaries and human connection, institutional integrity and individual grace. Benjamin Clark filed his supplementary report documenting the disclosure meeting and the family's initial response. His law enforcement background made him skeptical of Sarah's chances of avoiding criminal prosecution, but he acknowledged that the family's willingness to consider accepting her donation suggested they might not support criminal charges. The state nursing board investigation would proceed regardless, but the hospital's own determination of Sarah's employment status might be influenced by the Roberts family's ultimate decision. Sarah spent the hours after the disclosure meeting in a state of suspended anxiety. She knew the Roberts family had every right to refuse her donation and to never want contact with her again. She had violated their trust in the most fundamental way, concealing her identity while insinuating herself into their lives during their most vulnerable moments. Yet she also dared to hope that they might understand her motivations, might recognize that her deception had been driven by love rather than malice, and might ultimately consent to the donation that could save Ethan's life. The conversation with Ethan was scheduled for February 21st, giving the Roberts family time to prepare themselves emotionally and allowing the hospital to arrange for appropriate psychological support. A child psychologist named Dr. Rachel Thompson met with Michael and Amanda beforehand to discuss strategies for presenting the information in a way that would be comprehensible and minimally traumatic for an 8-year-old dealing with serious illness. Dr. Thompson emphasized the importance of honesty while avoiding overwhelming detail. Ethan should be told that Sarah was his biological aunt and that she had saved his life with a bone marrow donation when he was a baby. He should understand that Sarah had been caring for him these past months because she loved him as family, even though she hadn't told anyone about their relationship. He should be given the opportunity to express his feelings about learning this information, and he should be allowed to ask questions without being rushed or pressured. Most importantly, Dr. Thompson stressed that Ethan should be given genuine agency in the decision about whether to accept Sarah's donation. While the ultimate legal authority rested with Michael and Amanda as his parents, Ethan's emotional investment in the decision would be crucial to his psychological recovery regardless of the physical outcome. If he felt he had been forced into accepting a donation he didn't want, it could create lasting trauma. Conversely, if he chose to accept the donation, it could give him a sense of empowerment during a period when illness had stripped him of so much control over his own life. The meeting took place in Ethan's hospital room with Michael, Amanda, Dr. Thompson, and Dr. Martinez present. Ethan was weak but alert, his condition having stabilized somewhat over the past several days. He had been told that his parents needed to discuss something important with him about his treatment, and his young face showed a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Amanda began by reminding Ethan that he had been adopted as a baby, something he had known for several years. She explained that his biological mother had died in a car accident when he was very small, and that he had been very sick afterward. The doctors had given him medicine from a special donor that helped him get better, and then Michael and Amanda had adopted him and become his parents. Ethan nodded, familiar with this basic history. Michael then explained that the special donor who had helped Ethan when he was a baby was his biological aunt, his mother's sister. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was someone Ethan already knew, his nurse Sarah, who had been taking care of him for the past many months. Ethan's eyes widened with surprise as he processed this information. He looked around at the adults in the room, trying to understand why no one had told him this before. Dr. Thompson gently explained that sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't turn out exactly right, even when they're trying to do the right thing. Sarah had wanted to help take care of Ethan because she loved him as her nephew, but she had made a mistake by not telling everyone who she really was. Now everyone knew the truth, and they wanted Ethan to know it too, because it was his life and his family, and he deserved to understand what was happening. Amanda then introduced the medical situation as simply as possible. Ethan needed another treatment similar to the one he had received as a baby, medicine from a special donor to help his body fight the cancer. Sarah was willing to be that donor again because she was still a good match for him. But before anyone made any decisions, they wanted to know how Ethan felt about it. Did he want Sarah to help him again? Did he have questions about her being his aunt? Did he need time to think about everything he had just learned? Ethan was quiet for a long time, his young mind working through concepts that would challenge even an adult's understanding. Finally, he asked whether Sarah had been his nurse because she felt sorry for him. Amanda assured him that Sarah had been his nurse because she loved him and wanted to make sure he got the best care possible. Ethan asked whether Michael and Amanda were still his real parents. Michael assured him that they absolutely were and always would be. Sarah, being his biological aunt, didn't change anything about their family. Ethan then asked a question that made all the adults in the room pause. He wanted to know if Sarah had been sad when she gave him up for adoption as a baby. Dr. Thompson helped field this question, explaining that Sarah had wanted Ethan to have a family with a mom and dad who could take care of him all the time, and that's why she had made the choice she did. Sometimes people make very hard decisions because they love someone and want what's best for them, even if it makes them sad. After more questions and careful answers, Ethan expressed a simple sentiment that cut through all the complex ethical considerations the adults had been wrestling with. He said he liked Sarah, that she had been nice to him and had helped him feel better when he was scared, and that if she wanted to help him again, that was okay with him. He didn't completely understand all the grown-up reasons why there was a problem, but he understood that Sarah was family and that she wanted to help him live. Michael and Amanda looked at each other with expressions of relief and residual concern. Their son's acceptance of the situation was touching, but also reminded them of the innocence they were trying to protect. They assured Ethan that they would think carefully about everything and make the best decision for him, but that they were glad to know how he felt about it. After Ethan became tired and needed to rest, the adults convened outside his room. Michael and Amanda informed Catherine, who had been waiting for the outcome, that they were prepared to consent to Sarah's donation. They requested that Sarah be allowed to visit Ethan briefly before the donation procedure, so that he could see her and understand that she was still the same person he had known, just with a different relationship to him than he had realized. The decision meant that Portland Memorial Hospital would proceed with facilitating a bone marrow donation that would save a child's life, but would also require the institution to navigate unprecedented ethical territory. Sarah Mitchell would have the opportunity to save her nephew for the second time, but she would do so while facing the collapse of her professional career and the uncertainty of what her relationship with Ethan could be in the future. The path forward had been chosen, but the consequences of that choice were still unfolding in ways that no one could fully predict. March 3, 2024. The bone marrow transplant unit at Portland Memorial Hospital operated with the quiet efficiency of a space designed for life-saving procedures. Sarah Mitchell sat in a pre-operative room, dressed in a hospital gown, awaiting the procedure that would once again make her the source of her nephew's survival. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of medical evaluations, legal consultations, and emotional reckonings that had stripped away any remaining illusions about the consequences of her choices. The Roberts family's decision to accept Sarah's donation had set in motion a complex series of events that extended far beyond the medical procedure itself. Catherine Reynolds had convened multiple meetings with hospital administrators, legal counsel, and ethics committee members to establish protocols for a donation that occurred under such unprecedented circumstances. The hospital needed to protect itself from potential liability while also ensuring that Ethan received the life-saving treatment he desperately needed. Benjamin Clark had completed his final investigative report, documenting every aspect of Sarah's conduct over the preceding months. The report was comprehensive and damning from a regulatory standpoint, cataloging violations of hospital policy, state nursing regulations, and potentially several criminal statutes related to the unauthorized distribution of controlled substances. Yet Benjamin had added an unprecedented personal note to his conclusions, acknowledging that Sarah's case presented ethical complexities that transcended standard enforcement protocols. The State Nursing Board had scheduled a formal hearing for April 15th to determine the final disposition of Sarah's nursing license. The emergency suspension remained in effect, meaning Sarah could not work as a nurse anywhere in Oregon, regardless of Portland Memorial Hospital's employment decision. The board's investigative staff had interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed extensive documentation, and prepared a case that would likely result in permanent license revocation. However, the nursing board had also received an unexpected intervention. 17 families who had received assistance from Sarah's Henderson Foundation had submitted letters to the board describing their experiences. These families detailed the desperate financial circumstances they had faced while caring for children with serious illnesses, the inadequacy of insurance coverage for pediatric cancer treatment, and the profound impact that Sarah's assistance had made during their darkest hours. Several of Sarah's colleagues from the pediatric oncology ward had also written to the board, describing her exceptional patient care, her dedication to the families she served, and her willingness to go beyond professional requirements to ensure children received comprehensive support. These letters acknowledged that Sarah had violated policies and regulations, but they contextualized her actions within a healthcare system that often failed the most vulnerable patients and their families. Dr. Jennifer Martinez had taken the unusual step of submitting her own letter to the nursing board, written in her capacity as a physician rather than as a hospital administrator. Jennifer's letter described Sarah's clinical competence, her ability to recognize subtle changes in patient conditions that less experienced nurses might miss, and her emotional intelligence in working with frightened children and stressed families. The letter argued that permanently removing such a skilled practitioner from nursing would ultimately harm future patients who might benefit from her care. The donation procedure itself was scheduled for March 3rd, carefully timed to coincide with Ethan's treatment protocol. The medical team had prepared Ethan's body to receive the transplant through intensive chemotherapy designed to eliminate his existing bone marrow and create space for the new cells to engraft. The process was physically brutal, leaving Ethan weak and vulnerable to infection, but it was necessary to give the transplant the best chance of success. Sarah had undergone her own preparation, including medications to stimulate her bone marrow to produce extra stem cells that could be harvested for donation. The procedure would involve extracting bone marrow directly from her hip bones using needles, a process that was painful but generally safe. Sarah would require several days of recovery, but the long-term health risks were minimal. She had signed extensive consent forms acknowledging all potential complications, though her primary concern was not her own well-being, but rather ensuring that the donation successfully saved Ethan's life. The hospital had arranged for Sarah to visit with Ethan briefly the day before the donation procedure. The meeting took place in Ethan's isolation room, where he remained quarantined to prevent infections while his immune system was compromised. Sarah had to wear full protective gear, including a mask, gown, and gloves, making her appearance somewhat alien and intimidating. Yet when she entered the room, Ethan recognized her immediately despite the barriers. The visit was supervised by Dr. Rachel Thompson, the child psychologist, who observed the interaction to ensure it remained appropriate and beneficial for Ethan. Sarah approached Ethan's bedside with visible emotion, struggling to maintain composure as she saw how much the recent chemotherapy had affected him. He had lost the remainder of his hair, his skin was pale and fragile, and his small body looked diminished beneath the hospital blankets. Sarah spoke to Ethan about their shared history, explaining in simple terms that she had been his aunt his whole life, even though he hadn't known it. She told him about his biological mother, Lisa, describing her as someone who had loved him very much, but who had faced challenges that made it hard for her to take care of him. Sarah explained that when Lisa died, Sarah had made sure Ethan was safe and healthy, and that when he needed special medicine from her body, she had given it to him because that's what family does for each other. Ethan listened with the solemn attention of a child trying to understand adult complexities that exceeded his experience. He asked Sarah why she had pretended to be just a regular nurse instead of telling him she was his aunt. Sarah answered with honesty, calibrated to his age, explaining that she had been worried people might not let her take care of him if they knew the truth, and that she had wanted to be near him so badly that she had made a mistake by hiding who she really was. The conversation touched on the upcoming donation, with Sarah assuring Ethan that giving him the special medicine from her body didn't hurt too much and that she was happy to do it. She wanted him to know that after the donation she might not be able to visit him in the hospital as much because of rules about her job, but that she would always care about him and would always be his aunt, even if they couldn't see each other regularly. Ethan asked a question that revealed the depth of his understanding, despite his young age. He wanted to know if Sarah would get in trouble because she had helped him. Sarah acknowledged that yes, there would be consequences for the choices she had made, but that she had known that might happen and had decided helping him was more important than following rules that would have kept them apart. She told him that sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices and that she didn't regret her choice, even though it had caused problems. Before leaving, Sarah gave Ethan a small photo album she had compiled over the past weeks. The album contained pictures of Lisa Henderson, Ethan's biological mother, that Sarah had kept for years. The photos showed Lisa as a young woman, smiling and full of life, providing Ethan with images of the mother he had never known. Sarah explained that these pictures now belonged to Ethan, so he could remember that he came from someone who had loved him even though she couldn't stay with him. Michael and Amanda Roberts had observed this interaction from outside the isolation room through a window, accompanied by Dr. Thompson. Amanda wept as she watched Sarah share this painful history with Ethan, recognizing the profound loss that Sarah had carried for 9 years and the love that had driven her to such extreme measures. Michael's expression was more conflicted, still processing anger at Sarah's deception alongside grudging respect for her dedication to their son. The donation procedure commenced early on the morning of March 3rd. Sarah was taken to the operating room where she would be placed under general anesthesia for the marrow extraction. The procedure would take several hours, with medical staff using specialized needles to withdraw marrow from multiple sites on her hip bones. The extracted marrow would be immediately processed and prepared for infusion into Ethan, who waited in his isolation room for the cells that might save his life. Catherine Reynolds monitored the procedure's progress from the administrative offices, receiving regular updates from the medical team. She had informed Portland Memorial Hospital's board of directors about the situation, and the board had requested a comprehensive briefing once the immediate medical crisis was resolved. Catherine knew that her handling of Sarah's case would be scrutinized, and that her recommendations about Sarah's employment status would carry significant weight in the board's final decision. The extraction procedure proceeded without complications, with the medical team successfully harvesting sufficient bone marrow to give Ethan's transplant a strong chance of success. Sarah emerged from anesthesia in the recovery room, experiencing the expected post-procedure pain, but expressing immediate concern about whether the donation had been adequate. The transplant coordinator assured her that the quantity and quality of the harvested marrow exceeded expectations, providing Ethan with the best possible foundation for engraftment. Ethan received the transplant later that same day, with the processed bone marrow infused into his bloodstream through a central line. The procedure itself was remarkably simple compared to the complex preparation that preceded it. The marrow was administered like a blood transfusion, with the stem cells naturally finding their way to Ethan's bones, where they would hopefully establish themselves and begin producing healthy blood cells. The true test would come over the following weeks as doctors monitored whether Ethan's body accepted the donation and whether his immune system began to rebuild. Sarah remained hospitalized for 2 days following the donation, recovering from the procedure and receiving pain management. During this time, she received unexpected visitors. Several families who had benefited from the Henderson Foundation came to express their gratitude, bringing cards and small gifts to acknowledge her sacrifice. These families had learned about Sarah's situation through the hospital grapevine and wanted her to know that her assistance had made profound differences in their lives. One mother described how Sarah's financial help had allowed her to stay at the hospital with her daughter during a critical treatment period rather than having to work to pay medical bills. Another father explained that Sarah's assistance had covered medication copays that his insurance wouldn't pay, preventing his son from having to skip necessary prescriptions. A grandmother shared that Sarah's contribution had paid for gas money and cheap motel stays during months of traveling back and forth to Portland for her grandson's treatment, expenses that would have been impossible on her fixed income. These testimonials provided Sarah with some measure of consolation as she faced the reality of her professional future. She had lost her nursing career, at least temporarily, and possibly permanently. She had exhausted her savings and accumulated debt through her charitable efforts. She faced potential criminal prosecution for the medication diversion. Yet hearing these families describe how her actions had eased their suffering gave her choices meaning beyond the institutional rules she had violated. The hospital's ethics committee convened on March 6th to review Sarah's case and provide recommendations to the administration. The committee included physicians, nurses, administrators, community representatives, and a medical ethicist from the local university. They reviewed all evidence compiled by Catherine's investigation, considered the testimony of families Sarah had helped, and debated the appropriate institutional response to conduct that was simultaneously harmful and helpful. The Ethics Committee's deliberations highlighted fundamental tensions in healthcare delivery. Members acknowledged that Sarah had violated essential professional boundaries designed to protect both patients and practitioners. These boundaries existed for good reasons: to prevent conflicts of interest, ensure objectivity in care decisions, and maintain institutional integrity. Yet the committee also recognized that the healthcare system's failures had created the desperate circumstances that motivated Sarah's actions. The committee discussed at length whether Sarah's conduct constituted a form of civil disobedience, breaking unjust rules to highlight systemic problems. Some members argued that Sarah's medication distribution scheme, while technically illegal, had addressed a real need created by pharmaceutical pricing policies that made essential medications unaffordable, even for insured healthcare workers. Others contended that regardless of her motivations, Sarah had violated fundamental principles that could not be overlooked without undermining the entire regulatory framework. The committee's final report acknowledged these complexities while providing concrete recommendations. They advised that Sarah should not be allowed to return to direct patient care at Portland Memorial Hospital, given the irreparable breach of trust her deception represented. However, they suggested the hospital could consider employing Sarah in a non-clinical capacity where her knowledge and dedication could benefit patients without creating conflict of interest concerns. They also recommended that the hospital establish an official fund to assist families facing financial hardship, institutionalizing the support Sarah had been providing through irregular channels. Benjamin Clark received word on March 8th that the district attorney's office had declined to prosecute Sarah for the medication diversion. The prosecutor assigned to review the case had determined that while Sarah's conduct technically violated controlled substance laws, the circumstances, no personal financial gain, medications going to people with legitimate medical needs, cooperation with the investigation, made criminal prosecution neither appropriate nor in the public interest. The decision lifted one enormous burden from Sarah's shoulders, though the nursing board hearing still loomed. Ethan's medical progress became the focus of everyone's attention as the days following the transplant unfolded. The critical question was whether Sarah's donated marrow would successfully engraft in Ethan's bones and begin producing healthy blood cells. For the first week, Ethan remained in isolation, his body existing in a vulnerable state without a functional immune system. Any infection during this period could be fatal, requiring constant vigilance from the medical staff. Dr. Martinez monitored Ethan's blood counts daily, looking for early signs of engraftment. The process was agonizingly slow, with incremental changes that could indicate either successful transplant or catastrophic failure. Michael and Amanda maintained a constant presence at the hospital, wearing protective gear to visit their son, watching for any sign of improvement or decline, and enduring the uncertainty that characterized the post-transplant waiting period. Sarah remained in Portland, though she was no longer working at the hospital and was barred from visiting patients outside of the supervised contact with Ethan that had been permitted before the donation. She spent her days preparing for the nursing board hearing, meeting with an attorney who had agreed to represent her pro bono after learning about her case, and trying to imagine what her future might hold without the nursing career that had defined her adult life. On March 15th, 12 days after the transplant, Ethan's blood counts showed the first unmistakable signs of engraftment. His white blood cell count began to rise, indicating that the donated marrow had successfully established itself and was producing new immune cells. The medical team cautiously celebrated this milestone, knowing that many challenges remained, but recognizing that Ethan had passed the most critical hurdle. The transplant was working. Catherine Reynolds personally delivered the news to Sarah, finding her in the hospital cafeteria where she had been meeting with her attorney. Sarah's reaction was pure relief, with tears flowing freely as she processed the information that Ethan would survive. Catherine sat with Sarah for a long while, discussing not the administrative complications that still needed to be resolved, but simply acknowledging the profound significance of what Sarah had accomplished through her sacrifice and stubbornness. The successful transplant changed the context for all remaining decisions about Sarah's situation. The hospital's board of directors, which had been considering how to respond to a nurse who had violated numerous policies, now faced the reality that this same nurse had twice saved a child's life at considerable personal cost. The nursing board, preparing a case for license revocation, now confronted the narrative of a practitioner whose violations had been motivated by compassion rather than malfeasance. Public awareness of Sarah's situation had been growing through the grapevine of hospital staff, patient families, and community connections. Local media outlets began inquiring about rumors of a nurse who had lost her license for helping sick children. Catherine and the hospital's communications director carefully managed these inquiries, balancing patient privacy concerns against growing pressure for transparency about a case that seemed to challenge conventional assumptions about healthcare ethics. On March 20th, a local television station aired a feature story about families struggling with pediatric cancer treatment costs, including interviews with several families who had received assistance from the Henderson Foundation. While the story did not identify Sarah by name, it described her situation in enough detail that anyone familiar with the case could recognize it. The story framed Sarah's actions as a symptom of systemic healthcare failures, arguing that financial barriers to cancer treatment forced even healthcare professionals to take desperate measures to help vulnerable patients. The story generated significant public response, with hundreds of people contacting the television station to express support for the unnamed nurse and outrage at a healthcare system that had seemingly punished someone for helping sick children. Several state legislators reached out to the nursing board requesting information about the case and suggesting that the board's handling of the matter would receive close scrutiny. The political pressure did not change the fundamental regulatory questions at stake, but it created a context in which harsh punishment would be difficult to justify publicly. Sarah's attorney used the growing public awareness strategically, submitting to the nursing board a petition signed by over 2,000 healthcare workers, patient advocates, and community members requesting leniency in Sarah's case. The petition acknowledged Sarah's policy violations while arguing that her actions had highlighted critical gaps in the healthcare system's ability to serve vulnerable populations. The petition requested that the nursing board consider probation or suspension rather than permanent license revocation, allowing Sarah to eventually return to nursing practice under appropriate supervision. As March drew to a close, Ethan continued to recover steadily from the transplant. His immune system was rebuilding, his strength was returning, and his doctors were cautiously optimistic about his long-term prognosis. He would require months of careful monitoring and would remain vulnerable to complications, but he had survived the most dangerous phase of treatment. The child who had come so close to death was now contemplating a future that included returning to school, playing with his siblings, and eventually leaving the hospital that had been his home for nearly a year. The Roberts family began discussions about what their ongoing relationship with Sarah would look like. Michael and Amanda recognized that Sarah was biologically part of Ethan's family and that she had earned the right to remain connected to him through her extraordinary dedication and sacrifice. Yet they also needed to establish boundaries that protected their family's integrity while acknowledging Sarah's role. These conversations were delicate and emotional, requiring all parties to navigate unfamiliar territory without clear precedents to guide them. Catherine Reynolds prepared her final recommendations to Portland Memorial Hospital's board of directors regarding Sarah's employment status. Catherine's recommendation acknowledged that Sarah could not return to clinical nursing at the hospital, but proposed that Sarah be offered a position in the newly established Patient Family Services Department. This department would formalize and expand the support Sarah had been providing informally, offering financial counseling, assistance with insurance navigation, and emergency grants to families facing hardship during their children's treatment. The proposal represented a creative compromise that would allow Sarah to continue serving the patient population she cared so deeply about while avoiding the conflicts of interest that had compromised her nursing role. Sarah would work under close supervision, with clear policies and oversight mechanisms that would prevent the kinds of irregular activities she had engaged in previously. The position would pay less than her nursing salary and would not restore her clinical credentials, but it would provide a pathway forward that honored both her dedication and the need for institutional accountability. As April approached and the nursing board hearing date drew near, Sarah found herself at a crossroads unlike any she had previously faced. She had saved her nephew's life twice, exhausted her personal resources, ended her nursing career, and challenged the healthcare system's fundamental assumptions about professional boundaries and charitable giving. The consequences of her choices were still unfolding, and the final resolution of her case remained uncertain. Yet she had also succeeded in her primary objective. Ethan was alive, recovering, and would have the chance to grow up with the family that loved him. The question that remained was what Sarah's own future would hold, and whether the healthcare system would find a way to learn from her story, rather than simply punishing her for the rules she had broken in service of a higher calling. April 15, 2024. The Oregon State Nursing Board hearing room occupied the third floor of a government building in downtown Salem, 50 miles south of Portland. The space was designed for administrative proceedings rather than criminal trials, with a long table for board members facing a smaller table where respondents and their attorneys sat. Approximately 30 observers filled the public seating area, an unusually large audience for what typically drew only the parties directly involved in disciplinary proceedings. Sarah Mitchell entered the hearing room accompanied by her attorney, Christopher Hayes, a healthcare law specialist who had taken her case after being approached by several nurses who knew Sarah's situation. Christopher had spent the past 6 weeks preparing a defense strategy that acknowledged Sarah's violations while contextualizing them within broader systemic issues. He knew the board had authority to revoke Sarah's license permanently, and his primary goal was to secure an outcome that might eventually allow Sarah to return to nursing practice. The nursing board consisted of 7 members, 4 registered nurses with extensive clinical and administrative experience, 2 public representatives appointed to ensure community perspective, and 1 licensed practical nurse. The board chair, Patricia Morrison, was a nurse with over 30 years of experience who had built a reputation for fairness, tempered with strict adherence to professional standards. Patricia called the hearing to order and explained the procedures that would govern the proceedings. The board's investigative staff presented their case first, documenting Sarah's violations in meticulous detail. The presentation covered her unauthorized access to medical records, her concealment of her biological relationship to Ethan Roberts, her diversion of controlled substances from hospital inventory, her operation of an unlicensed medication distribution scheme, and her unauthorized transfers from hospital discretionary funds. Each violation was supported by extensive documentation, witness testimony, and Sarah's own admissions from her interview with Catherine Reynolds. The investigative staff's presentation lasted nearly 2 hours, building a comprehensive case that Sarah had violated multiple provisions of Oregon's Nurse Practice Act and had engaged in conduct that demonstrated unfitness to practice nursing. The staff attorney recommended permanent license revocation, arguing that the severity and duration of Sarah's violations showed a fundamental disregard for professional standards that could not be remediated through lesser sanctions. Christopher Hayes then presented Sarah's defense, which did not contest the factual allegations, but instead provided context and mitigation. He began with Sarah's personal history, the death of her sister Lisa in a tragic accident, Sarah's role as temporary guardian for infant Ethan, her bone marrow donation that saved his life, and the emotional complexity of watching him be adopted by another family. Christopher emphasized that Sarah's violations had not been motivated by personal gain or malice, but rather by an overwhelming need to protect and care for a child to whom she had profound biological and emotional connections. The defense presentation included testimony from Dr. Jennifer Martinez, who described Sarah's exceptional clinical competence and her ability to provide outstanding patient care, even while dealing with the emotional burden of her hidden relationship with Ethan. Jennifer's testimony acknowledged that Sarah had violated professional boundaries, but argued that her clinical judgment and patient care skills had never been compromised by her personal situation. Catherine Reynolds provided testimony about her investigation and her observations of Sarah's conduct throughout the 6-month period in question. Catherine described the medication diversion scheme in detail, explaining how Sarah had been helping financially distressed colleagues access necessary medications at cost rather than operating a profit-making enterprise. Catherine also testified about the Henderson Foundation and the families who had benefited from Sarah's financial assistance, many of whom had submitted letters to the board describing their desperate circumstances and the impact Sarah's help had made. Christopher then called several of these families to testify directly. A mother named Jessica Winters described how her daughter's cancer treatment had pushed the family to the brink of bankruptcy despite having health insurance. The medication copays, travel expenses, and lost wages from taking time off work had accumulated to impossible levels. Sarah's assistance had covered critical medication costs during a month when the family literally could not afford to fill their daughter's prescriptions. Jessica's testimony was emotional but powerful, humanizing the abstract statistics about healthcare costs that often fail to capture the lived reality of families facing catastrophic illness. A hospital colleague named Patricia Chen testified about the informal medication assistance network that Sarah had facilitated. Patricia explained that she worked as a medical technician, earning modest wages while caring for her elderly mother, who required expensive medications for diabetes and heart disease. Even with insurance, the copays exceeded what Patricia could afford on her salary. Sarah had obtained the medications at employee discount rates and had passed them along at cost, allowing Patricia to keep her mother properly medicated. Patricia acknowledged that the arrangement had violated regulations, but argued that it had addressed a genuine need created by pharmaceutical pricing policies that made essential medications unaffordable. The testimony that made the strongest impact came from an unexpected source. Michael and Amanda Roberts appeared before the board to describe their experience with Sarah and to advocate for leniency in her case. Michael testified about learning that their son's devoted nurse was actually his biological aunt, who had been concealing her identity for months. He acknowledged feeling betrayed and angry when the truth emerged, but he also described watching Sarah donate bone marrow to save Ethan's life for the second time, and recognizing that her violations had been driven by love rather than deception for its own sake. Amanda's testimony was particularly emotional as she described the financial strain of Ethan's treatment and the mysterious anonymous payments that had helped their family survive during the darkest months. Learning that these payments came from Sarah, a nurse who was sacrificing her own financial security to help them, had fundamentally changed Amanda's understanding of Sarah's character. Amanda argued that permanently revoking Sarah's nursing license would be a loss not just for Sarah, but for future patients who might benefit from her extraordinary dedication and skill. The most powerful moment of the hearing came when the board members questioned Sarah directly. Patricia Morrison asked Sarah to explain in her own words why she had made the choices that led to this disciplinary proceeding. Sarah's response was honest and unvarnished. She acknowledged that she had known her actions violated policies and regulations, but that she had felt trapped between competing moral obligations. She had watched her nephew nearly die once before and had been unable to stand aside when she learned he was critically ill again. She had seen families destroyed by medical bills that insurance didn't cover and had been unable to ignore their suffering. Sarah admitted she had told herself she would stop, that she would maintain appropriate boundaries and follow proper procedures. But each time she saw a child in pain or a parent crying over medical bills, she had rationalized one more violation, one more exception, until she had created a pattern of conduct that she now recognized was unsustainable and inappropriate. She accepted full responsibility for her choices and expressed genuine remorse for violating the trust that patients and colleagues had placed in her. One board member asked Sarah whether she would make the same choices again if faced with similar circumstances. Sarah paused before answering, recognizing the trap inherent in the question. She finally responded that she hoped she would have the wisdom to find better solutions that didn't require violating professional standards, but that she could not honestly say she would allow a child to suffer or a family to be destroyed by medical debt simply because rules prohibited her from helping? The answer was not what the board wanted to hear from a disciplinary standpoint, but it reflected Sarah's authentic struggle with the ethical complexities of her situation. The hearing concluded after 6 hours of testimony and questioning. Patricia Morrison explained that the board would deliberate in private session and would issue a written decision within 30 days. Sarah left the hearing emotionally exhausted, but also feeling that she had been given a fair opportunity to explain her actions and to present evidence of the broader context that had shaped her choices. While Sarah awaited the nursing board's decision, developments at Portland Memorial Hospital moved forward on a separate track. The hospital's board of directors had reviewed Catherine Reynolds' recommendations regarding Sarah's employment status. After extensive discussion and consultation with legal counsel, the board accepted Catherine's proposal to offer Sarah a position in the newly created Patient Family Services Department. The offer was contingent on the nursing board not imposing sanctions that would prohibit Sarah from working in healthcare settings entirely. The Patient Family Services Department represented a significant institutional change at Portland Memorial Hospital. The department would formalize support services that had previously been provided inconsistently or not at all. A dedicated staff would help families navigate insurance complexities, apply for financial assistance programs, access community resources, and receive emergency grants for expenses that threatened to disrupt their children's treatment. The department would be funded through a combination of hospital budget allocations and external fundraising, with the Henderson Foundation serving as the initial donor base. Sarah's role in this department would not require an active nursing license, as her responsibilities would focus on coordination and advocacy rather than direct patient care. However, her nursing background and her lived experience with the challenges families faced would inform the department's work. The position represented both a career change and an opportunity for Sarah to continue serving the population she cared about without the conflicts of interest that had compromised her nursing role. Ethan Roberts continued his recovery throughout April, reaching milestones that brought his family cautious optimism about his long-term prognosis. His bone marrow function had normalized, his immune system was rebuilding steadily, and his cancer remained in remission. The medical team began discussing discharge planning, anticipating that Ethan might be able to return home within a few months if his progress continued. The transformation from the critically ill child who had nearly died in January to a recovering patient contemplating normal childhood activities was remarkable. The Roberts family worked with Dr. Rachel Thompson to establish a framework for ongoing contact between Ethan and Sarah. The arrangement would allow Sarah to visit Ethan regularly once he returned home, with the understanding that Michael and Amanda remained his parents and primary family. Sarah would be Aunt Sarah, a special person in Ethan's life who had helped save him and who cared deeply about him, but not someone who would replace or compete with his adoptive parents. The arrangement required trust and communication from all parties, but the foundation had been laid during the difficult months of crisis and disclosure. On May 3rd, the Oregon State Nursing Board issued its decision in Sarah Mitchell's case. The decision was lengthy and detailed, reflecting the board's careful consideration of the complex factors involved. The board found that Sarah had violated multiple provisions of the Nurse Practice Act and that her conduct warranted serious disciplinary action. However, the board also acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances that had motivated her violations and the absence of harm to patients from her actions. The board's decision imposed a 3-year suspension of Sarah's nursing license, with the possibility of reinstatement after 2 years if Sarah completed specific requirements. These requirements included comprehensive ethics training, supervised clinical practice to demonstrate she could maintain appropriate boundaries, and continued compliance with all licensing requirements. The decision effectively removed Sarah from nursing practice for a minimum of 2 years, while creating a pathway for her eventual return to the profession if she could demonstrate rehabilitation. The decision represented a middle ground between the permanent revocation the investigative staff had recommended and the probation that Sarah's supporters had requested. The board explained that Sarah's violations had been too serious to address through probation alone, but that permanently removing a skilled practitioner from nursing would serve no constructive purpose given the circumstances. The board hoped that Sarah's case would prompt broader discussions about healthcare system failures that forced professionals into ethical dilemmas like those Sarah had faced. Sarah received the decision with mixed emotions. The 2-year minimum suspension meant that her nursing career was effectively over for the foreseeable future, and there was no guarantee she would successfully complete the reinstatement requirements. However, the decision was far better than permanent revocation, and it acknowledged that her violations had been motivated by compassion rather than malice. She could accept the suspension as a fair consequence for choices she knew had been wrong, even if they had been well-intentioned. Portland Memorial Hospital officially offered Sarah the position in the Patient Family Services Department, with a start date of June 1st. The offer came with a salary significantly lower than her nursing income had been, reflecting her new, non-clinical role. However, the position provided health insurance, retirement benefits, and the opportunity to continue working in healthcare settings with the family she had dedicated herself to serving. Sarah accepted the offer, recognizing it as both a career change and a form of redemption. The Henderson Foundation was restructured to operate under Portland Memorial Hospital's organizational umbrella, with proper oversight and funding mechanisms. Sarah remained involved with the foundation, but no longer controlled it independently. The foundation's board now included hospital administrators, community representatives, and parents of current and former patients. The restructured foundation raised over $100,000 in its first fundraising campaign, demonstrating substantial community support for assisting families facing the financial challenges of pediatric cancer treatment. Several of Sarah's former nursing colleagues who had benefited from her informal medication assistance program faced their own professional consequences. The hospital conducted internal reviews of each individual's conduct, ultimately determining that most had been unaware they were participating in illegal medication distribution. These employees received mandatory ethics training but were not terminated or reported to licensing boards. The hospital also established a formal employee assistance program to help staff members facing financial hardships, addressing the systemic problem that had made Sarah's unauthorized assistance network seem necessary. By late May, Ethan Roberts had recovered sufficiently to be discharged from Portland Memorial Hospital. His departure was celebrated by the pediatric oncology staff, who had cared for him through the darkest days of his illness. Ethan would require ongoing monitoring and periodic checkups, but he was returning home to his family and to a childhood that had been interrupted by cancer. The prognosis remained cautiously optimistic, with doctors projecting a high likelihood that Ethan would remain in remission long-term. Sarah attended a small celebration marking Ethan's discharge, invited by the Roberts family to acknowledge her role in his recovery. The gathering was bittersweet for Sarah, representing both the success of her efforts to save her nephew and the end of the intense connection they had shared during his hospitalization. She gave Ethan a gift she had carefully chosen, a children's book about family and belonging, inscribed with a message about being loved by many people in many different ways. The broader impact of Sarah's case extended beyond the individuals directly involved. Several healthcare policy organizations took interest in the systemic issues her story had highlighted. Research studies documented the financial toxicity of cancer treatment and the inadequacy of insurance coverage for families facing catastrophic illness. Advocacy groups used Sarah's experience to argue for policy reforms that would reduce out-of-pocket costs for pediatric cancer treatment and create better support systems for affected families. The Oregon legislature commissioned a study of healthcare affordability issues, including specific examination of why even insured families faced financial ruin from serious illnesses. The study's preliminary findings confirmed what Sarah's case had illustrated, that insurance coverage often failed to protect families from devastating medical expenses, and that healthcare professionals were increasingly confronted with ethical dilemmas created by the gap between patients' needs and available resources. On June 1st, Sarah Mitchell began her new role as a patient-family advocate at Portland Memorial Hospital. Her office was located in the same building where she had worked as a nurse, but her responsibilities were entirely different. She spent her days meeting with families newly diagnosed with serious illnesses, helping them understand their insurance coverage, connecting them with financial assistance programs, and providing emotional support during overwhelmingly difficult times. The work was challenging and emotionally draining, but it allowed Sarah to use her knowledge and experience to help families without the conflicts of interest that had compromised her nursing practice. Catherine Reynolds reflected on the case in her annual report to the hospital's board of directors. She acknowledged that Sarah's situation had exposed significant weaknesses in Portland Memorial Hospital's policies and oversight mechanisms. The hospital had failed to detect Sarah's undisclosed relationship with Ethan for months, had inadequate controls on medication inventory, and had not recognized signs of an employee in financial and emotional distress. Catherine's report included recommendations for policy changes, improved training, and better support systems for staff members facing personal challenges that might compromise their professional judgment. The case also prompted Portland Memorial Hospital to examine its institutional culture around professional boundaries and compassionate care. The hospital wanted to avoid creating an environment where strict rule enforcement prevented staff from genuinely caring about patients and their families. Yet the hospital also needed to maintain appropriate boundaries that protected both patients and staff from the complications that arose when personal relationships infiltrated professional settings. Finding the right balance would require ongoing attention and adjustment. By the end of summer 2024, a new normal had emerged for all the parties whose lives had been transformed by Sarah Mitchell's choices. Ethan Roberts attended school for the first time in over a year, a healthy child with a complicated family history who would grow up knowing that several adults had made extraordinary sacrifices to ensure his survival. Michael and Amanda Roberts had weathered a crisis that tested their marriage, their finances, and their assumptions about family, emerging with deeper understanding of the complexities that shaped modern healthcare. Sarah Mitchell worked in a profession that was familiar yet different from the nursing career she had trained for and practiced for over a decade. She lived with the consequences of her choices, the suspended nursing license, the financial recovery from her charitable spending, and the ongoing uncertainty about whether she would eventually return to clinical practice. Yet she also lived with the knowledge that her nephew was alive and thriving, and that the assistance she had provided to dozens of families had made genuine differences in their lives during their darkest hours. Portland Memorial Hospital implemented systemic changes that would outlast the individuals involved in Sarah's case. The Patient Family Services Department became a model that other hospitals examined and adapted for their own institutions. The reformed Henderson Foundation provided hundreds of thousands of dollars in assistance to families over subsequent years, help that was now properly structured and overseen rather than dependent on the informal efforts of a single overburdened nurse. The nursing board's decision in Sarah's case became required reading in nursing ethics courses throughout Oregon and eventually in other states as well. Educators used Sarah's story to illustrate the complexities of professional boundaries, the importance of transparency in therapeutic relationships, and the tensions between institutional rules and individual compassion. Students debated what they would have done in Sarah's situation, with no clear consensus emerging about the right course of action when professional obligations conflicted with deeply felt personal responsibilities. 2 years after the nursing board's decision, in May 2026, Sarah would become eligible to apply for reinstatement of her nursing license. Whether she would pursue reinstatement or continue in her patient advocacy role remained uncertain. The healthcare landscape would continue evolving, with ongoing debates about treatment costs, insurance adequacy, and the proper balance between professional boundaries and compassionate care. Sarah's case would remain a touchstone in these discussions, a real-world example of the impossible choices that sometimes confronted those who worked at the intersection of healthcare delivery and human suffering. The story that began with routine medication audits and ended with lives saved and careers transformed ultimately illustrated a fundamental truth about modern healthcare: that the system's complexity created situations where following every rule could mean abandoning basic human compassion, while choosing compassion sometimes required violating rules designed to protect everyone involved. Sarah Mitchell had chosen compassion and had paid a significant price for that choice. Yet, she had also saved her nephew's life twice and had helped dozens of families survive the financial devastation of serious illness. The question of whether her choices had been right or wrong remained contested, but the impact of those choices was undeniable. As Ethan Roberts grew older, he would gradually come to understand the full story of the adults who had shaped his survival: his biological mother who had died too young, his adoptive parents who had loved him unconditionally through the worst crisis of their lives, and his aunt who had given bone marrow twice and had sacrificed her career to watch over him. He would carry the weight of that knowledge as he built his own life, hopefully with the wisdom to honor the sacrifices made on his behalf, while also recognizing that love sometimes expressed itself in flawed and complicated ways. The investigation that began in December 2023 concluded not with simple answers about right and wrong, but with nuanced understanding of the impossible situations that arose when healthcare system failures collided with human need. Justice had been served through the nursing board's sanctions and the hospital's institutional reforms. But grace had also been extended through the decision not to permanently destroy Sarah's career, and through the Roberts family's willingness to embrace the complicated truth about the woman who had saved their son. In the end, perhaps that combination of justice and grace represented the best outcome anyone could have hoped for in a situation where perfect solutions never existed.